Good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Strawn, and on behalf of LOCS4Africa, welcome to today's session. LOCS4Africa is a global network of local and regional governments committed to sustainable urban development. We influence sustainable policy, drive local action for low emission, nature-based, equitable, resilient, and circular development. Today's session is made possible by the Rockefeller Foundation. And before we get started, I'd like to go through a few items so that you know how to participate in today's session. As you can see, you've been automatically muted. However, you will have the opportunity to submit text questions, and you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a Q&A box. Please submit your questions there and feel free to submit your questions throughout the session, and we will hopefully be able to answer them at the end of today's session. Today's session is also being recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording of the session on the platform after the closing today. Today's agenda, today's session will take place in the form of a fireside discussion. We will unpack how Africa's future will be shaped by young African leaders who think differently and are committed to break boundaries and do hard things. Therefore, we hope we can start thinking and discussing the answer to how we can build local leaders to solve global climate challenges. Today's session is also available in French and Portuguese. Where the Q&A box is, you'll also find the translation button, and in that box you can select either French or Portuguese, whichever you prefer to listen to. If you do not select French or Portuguese, you'll hear the session in English, as all speakers will be presenting in English today. So before we begin, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Today's session will be facilitated by Pato, a young African leader from Botswana, a member of the Global Shapers community. And in 2014, Pato was chosen as the only representative of the African youth at the UN Climate Summit in New York. Our guests today include Akufuna, a youth development and climate justice advocate in Zambia, Gugu, a political communications specialist and the National Development Plan 2030 ambassador, and a senior social and environmental justice advocate. Nisarine, who is a member of the UN Secretary General Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change and General Coordinator for the Youth and Environment in Sudan. We have Tumi, who is the founding director of the Ushi Group and a finance specialist. And lastly, we have Robin, who is the co-director of the Urban Movement Innovation Fund, also known as UMI. The fund works to connect and align and strengthen people power for zero carbon future. So we have a wonderful group of speakers today, and thank you so much for joining us today in this fireside discussion. So before I hand over to Pato, who will be facilitating today's roundtable discussion, I'd like us to play a video, and today's video, which highlights Recycle Up Ghana, which is an amazing initiative that strives to empower youth to develop local solutions to environmental and societal problems. And this is truly making a huge difference. Enjoy the video.
Hello everyone, my name is Abdul Rahim Shaibisa, and I'm the Executive Director for Recycle Up Ghana. I'm excited to be with you today at the 5th Local Climate Solution for Africa Congress. It is indeed a great privilege to be called upon to share my experiences and expertise with Recycle Up Ghana on jobs for climate. My organization, Recycle Up Ghana, has over the past 5 years been working with young Ghanaians to raise awareness on plastic waste pollution and creating value for waste through entrepreneurial and educational programs. We do this through a 3-phase approach, which is the knowledge phase, where we collaborate with experts in the industry to provide young Ghanaians with knowledge to empower them, raise awareness, and develop sustainable solutions. In the second phase, which is the experience phase, We provide young people the opportunity to learn on the job through volunteering and internship on projects to develop relevant working experience and skills to properly position them to be environmental change makers. In the last phase, which is the solution phase, we support young Ghanaians to combine the knowledge and the experiences that they have acquired so far to develop entrepreneurial solutions that promote circularity and climate resilience. We have worked with the various local government institutions and other private organizations to raise awareness to the plastic pollution and creating value for waste through programs like our schools recycling program, our plastic buyback programs, and our green business incubation program. In growing all these initiatives, one of the greatest insights we identified is that local problems are best solved by the local people, because they, the local people, understand the problem and their needs better than anyone else. It is this belief that has guided us to focus more on developing the capacity of the local person through skills and entrepreneurial development to develop disruptive solutions that create jobs and also solve an environmental challenge. You will agree with me that if we are to have local people take charge of developing their own solutions, then we need to do a good job in creating an enabling environment for them to be able to innovate. One of the key drivers in creating this enabling environment for innovation, in my opinion, is the Innovations Hub. These hubs are centers that empower people to harness and leverage their creativity to develop solutions. These hubs are exploring both soft skills and technical skills to build the capacity of the youth in Africa to develop an entrepreneurial mindset. With almost every African country having at least one of these innovation hubs, I believe that they will position us to create more jobs and also develop solutions to the many problems that we face in Africa. However, we need more of them, and also more with dedicated focus on climate solutions. One aspect that I feel missing and I haven't seen happening most is the support in developing, prototyping, and testing of climate solutions. For example, most of the ideas that we developed in the first cohort of our Green Business Incubation Program were just basic but bold ideas that needs a lot of support in terms of prototyping and testing to develop a product that is market fit and ready to get onto the market. If they do not get these supports, the idea will only remain an idea in their heads. What I would love to see is a lot of makerspace spread across the continent that is dedicated to prototyping and testing green and climate resilient solutions. As I wrap up my speech, I would love to share with you some of the impact that we have made through some of the insights I shared with you earlier on. Through soft skills training, Recycle Up Ghana have trained over 180 recycling ambassadors who are currently environmental activists and raising awareness in different parts of the country. Through entrepreneurs in our incubation program and our schools recycling program, we are currently collecting and recycling up to 60 tons of plastic waste per month. These plastic waste have been diverted from getting into the landfill site and the ocean. In our incubation program, we have successfully supported the creation of 6 green businesses who are at various stages in their business operation and creating jobs for young Ghanaians. Once again, thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope my insights and experiences are useful to you in developing and creating a climate resilient solution in your individual countries. Of course, my organization, Recycle Up Ghana, is open to replicating our solutions in other African countries and are looking to explore with other partners as well. to make more impact and create a better world. I look forward to answering your questions in the showroom and enjoy the rest of the session. Thank you very much.
Indeed. The future, which begins now, is for and about young people. In Africa, close to 50% of the population is below the age of 18. We have to see climate action as an opportunity, as Recycle Up Ghana is doing, to deliver jobs, opportunities, economic security for this large and high-powered generation. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining this session. To those of you joining us online, my name is Batla Kilisite, and I am the host of Sustain 267 podcast. But today I'm hosting other youth in conversation on learning from youth leaders on climate, on solving global climate challenges and realizing not only the potential of ourselves, but the potential of environmentally sustainable solutions to realize the Sustainable Development Goals and the Africa we want. Africa's future will be shaped by young African leaders who think progressively and are committed to breaking boundaries and taking challenges head on. That being said, here's something to ponder on. How can we build local leaders to solve global climate challenges? To unpack this idea and this question, I'm joined by Akufuna, Gugu, Nazreen, Thumi, and Robin. Thank you so much for joining me. To kick off the conversation, the first question is, when we look at Africa's future, experts often cite the continent's large, growing youth population as an asset, popularly called the youth dividend. How are we going to empower them with skills, with training and technology necessary to make lasting change and meaningful progress in the fight against climate change? Nazreen, do you want to tackle this one? Nazreen, I think, there we go.
Yeah, I hope you can see and hear me well. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Nasreen, and I'm from Sudan. Well, yeah, of course, there is many pillars of actually the question you asked. The main one is about why are we doing this and how are we going to do it, and then what do we want to achieve at the end. So we actually, what we are doing right now is very much linked to the young generation's future and the African continent future. So for a lot of various range of young people, this is a matter of life or death. So we can't actually bargain on this, and we can't actually somehow stop doing what we are doing currently. The ways of doing what we are doing right now actually varies also. It depends a lot on the area. It depends a lot on the national and regional context. It depends a lot on the current issues actually every individual in their community, every young people are actually facing. For example, only a few months ago in Sudan, we had a very devastating floods. So our immediate reaction to the flood was actually a disaster risk reduction, trying to relieve the destroyed houses, provide shelter for homeless, and also trying to stop the flooding of the water. But the actual proper work was supposed to happen many months ago, where we actually predict the amount of water that we're receiving this year. We grow planting accordingly, we move people from places accordingly, and so on. A lot of work is still ahead of us, but I think young people of Africa are very much able to do it. They just need a chance.
I think that feeds into the conversation of resilience, building resilience in Africa, rather being proactive instead of reactive once the natural disasters have struck. Thumi, you work with technology. Well, you work in the finance space. How do we?
I do actually also like work on time. Yeah, continue.
How do we leverage? In your area, how do we leverage technology and finance to upskill African youth to address the fight against climate change?
That's a fantastic question, which finds practical application within what Africa has been able to achieve in crossing what were typical divides in things like financial inclusion. You think about M-Pesa in East Africa, you think about what's happening with Yoko in terms of disrupting the SMME space in terms of payment solutions. So from a financial inclusion analysis, we've seen how the African continent has bypassed some of the conventional sort of like pathways upon which the exchange of money, used to take place, and so we tend to align that technological pathway and building a resilience dividend from a financial perspective and a non-financial perspective to other forms of technologies that now that like things like renewable energy, for instance, if you think about battery storage, you think about things like solar, the cost of solar and wind farms or wind turbines having gone significantly down, we can start shaping a technological energy supply industry within an African context that can also bypass quite a lot of like the huge traditional pathways of like energy supply. So the marriage between the low cost of technological innovation through collaboration with other countries in the world that have obviously had the capital base to do the research funded by like their governments and their own development initiatives. We can collaborate with such countries for the prosperity of the continent, and I think it feeds into the conversation that like we're having now, that us as people that are young should be able to be in those rooms when plans that are going to have a 30-year impact or 40-year impact or 50-year impact, we need to be in those conversations as well as people that like are benchmarking where these conversations need to go. So there is a very good conversation around us with technological development, the changing of climate finance, or like what is climate resistant finance, and also what is the role of the youth in those rooms when those pathways are discussed. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how everybody else unpacks it from their respective platforms.
Yeah, I'm ditto to a lot of what you said. You touched on research, and I know, Gugu, this is an area that you've done quite a bit of work in. I actually used one of the research papers that you did, the Afrobarometer one on climate change in Botswana, for one of my assignments. What role will research then play if we're now looking at the question that I previously asked of upskilling and training and engaging technology, also in light of what Itumeleng just said, that we're chartering a new path. In as much as that country is more developed than us, we're chartering a new path. What's the role of research?
Thank you so much for that question. Listen, there's two answers to it. First, to one of the few questions you just asked now, the issue of capacity building in Africa. And I think for us, more than anything, that way needs to start. The fact that significant majorities in not just in South Africa, but just across the continent are climate illiterate. So before we start doing any work, that's where we need to start. That's where we need to start, guided, of course, by Articles 11 and 12 of the Paris Agreement on capacity building. We need to, as youth, to call on to our respective governments for inclusive, or rather the inclusion of youth-friendly and, of course, accessible mechanisms to sort of educate other young people on the adverse effects of climate change. And in fact, how can our communities better prepare for climate change effects? If I were to break down like the numbers, for example, as of September 2018 in South Africa, more than half, which is 54% of South Africans, said that they've never even heard of climate change, right? And if you are disaggregating such data by social demographics, you see majority of these are rural women, rural residents, and even young people. There's still a significant proportion, more than half, that don't even know what climate change is, right? And I definitely think that even though it's not a Southern Africa problem, but also just across the continent, even data from the Afrobarometer sort of showed that Africans are still a little bit climate illiterate. And I think that's where we need to sort of start as youth activists who are in the in the climate space. In terms of speaking about research, and I think research contributes so importantly when you're about to speak about climate adaptation, right? And I think that African government needs to further look into the study of the effects of climate change on the most vulnerable minority groups in Africa, because currently and problematically so, there isn't any data or other research that's being conducted on how climate change sort of affects these groups such as disabled people, and how best we as the rest of the continent can sort of assist them to adapt to climate change. So the issue of research sort of filters in the fact that there isn't any currently available, and we sort of do need it in order for us to plan adequate plans, and especially on the education of climate change and the adaptation of climate change, in order for us to build awareness, in order for us to know, in order to us to act. We need to start on the education and the awareness part of it. I think I'm just gonna leave it there for now.
Definitely, we need to do the groundwork and make sure that we've got a strong foundation for all these solutions that we plan on piling on top of that. And as you're speaking about how this is affecting indigenous communities and women and so forth, a word that comes to mind is intersectionality, but we'll come back to that. The second question is, what does Africa's youth leadership mean for the continent's future? How do we move towards youth leadership on a continent where our presidents, the African presidents' average age is significantly higher, possibly as high as 3 times the average age of the continent? Akufuna, because we're talking leadership, and I know you're a climate reality leader, I'm going to throw that one to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pato, for that interesting, question. I think. First of all, I must mention that we need to now understand that climate change is no longer just a science issue, but actually climate change is most importantly a leadership issue. And if you are talking about 60% of Africa being young people, then you are talking about the need for these young people to be engaged civically and also socially in platforms that give them an opportunity to make critical decisions that define the future that we desire as a young people. Talk about the Agenda 2030. It's about young people. If we don't take responsibility, if we don't take leadership, that will become a rhetoric, because decisions are being made every day, but are young people participating civically or socially? Are young people concerned? Are young people involved? Are young people engaged in the first place? But also the biggest obstacle or challenge that I observed in my own little experience is that as young people, we often want to wait for the others to define for us how we should get involved, how we should get engaged. We don't have to wait for anyone to call on us to make a decision, to call on us to engage ourselves in things that matter. What is important to know is we are talking about our own future at the end of the day. A 75-year-old president with his cabinet of average 60 years olds can make a decision that will impact Africa for the next 10, 50 years, 100 years, like 2 million already mentioned earlier on. But if we disassociate ourselves to that kind of opportunity to influence such kind of leaders, then we lose an opportunity to define the Africa that we need. Climate change is real, and climate change is killing young people. There are no jobs for young people. Talk about the agriculture sector, which employs about 55% on average in Africa. The jobs that we have constitute about 50% from agriculture. But how are young people engaged? How are young people concerned about such kind of statistics? But also, the truth is the young people of Africa specifically have got the power, have got the required talent, have got the required passion to influence Because talk about politics in Africa, all the time is young people in the forefront. Talk about political violence, all the time is young people in the forefront. Talk about political campaigns, it's all the time young people in the forefront. Talk about the entertainment industries, always young people in the forefront. I've never seen a very successful, very old politician who has succeeded without using the energy, the ability embedded in the young people of Africa. But now, if we know that is the fact, it is now up to us as young people to leverage on this strength that we have, define ourselves according to what we are. The truth is we have the power on our side. We have the energy on our side. We have the time on our side. What is very important for young people in Africa is to come together.
We seem to have lost Akufuna there. Nazreen, would you like to? Oh, okay. Akufuna, you back?
Oh, you lost me?
We lost you for a little bit there, but I think we had gotten the essence of your message. Young people are already leading, and we need to be leading where it counts as well. Nazreen, you represent the African youth within the UN, African youth within climate change. What would you like to see more in terms of leadership? Is there enough leadership from our side? And then Robin, I know we're talking about Africa right now, but I'm also I'm going to reach out to you just after Nazreen, because we're in Europe, we're seeing a lot of youth leadership, but not only are we seeing a lot of youth leadership, we are seeing them actually create change. Things like the divestment movement that was led by some of the Oxford students. So then we'll tap into that. But Nazreen, in the meantime, what are you seeing as part of the UN youth?
Well, you asked a very important question. Yes, young people are in the front line of the movement, yet our leaders keep failing us. Actually, comparing to other delegations, sometimes the coherence between the African leaders and the African negotiators are not very much strong. For example, when it comes to the climate change negotiations. Also, on the national level, when you see how much they give attention to issues related to climate change, it's also not the required actions and engagement. Young people reach different meetings and conferences very hard because first of all, they get visa rejections all over the place. Their government doesn't do anything to support them. The second thing, even securing a fund to attend the meeting is very much hard, and also our government doesn't support us on this. Not only this, but very few governments actually include young people in the decision making and the policy making of their climate change planning and resilience strategies. Well, when we talk about how much we are there when it comes to population, when it comes to workforce, we are all over the place. But when we ask how much we are there when it comes to the decision making and also high level segments and representations, we are definitely not there. And unfortunately, people who are there doesn't represent us and doesn't deliver our voices. I think if we had stronger leaders, we've been able to actually cross very long way. Sometimes scientists and technical people struggle very much to talk with their ministers, to talk with their country presidents, because when it comes to the making decision on the high level, not the technical, not the scientists who make the decisions, it's the upper level who make the decisions. And when we don't have synergy, we don't have connection between the technical and the scientists, and we don't have them there on the board advising and talking to the ministers, talking to the presidents, talking to high levels, then how would the high levels know? I mean, no one was born like knowing everything, so you have to be honest with yourself and frank with your people, saying, well, I don't know this, I need help in that, because at the end climate change will affect the governments as much as people. We can now see and compare how did COVID-19 affected us. COVID-19 didn't only affect people, didn't only affect the poor people. COVID-19 affected everyone, especially the governments and the economies. So I think our leaders should do better, and we will keep demanding them to do better.
Definitely, as you talk about climate change, that we're not immune from the COVID-19 effects, and all of us felt it. No one was immune. Something that comes to mind is something that I read some time ago that says, well, on climate change and people prioritizing funding over climate action, that says there are no customers on a dead planet. Robin, now reaching out to you, we've seen quite a bit of youth leadership from your corner of the world. We've seen youth change some policies. We've seen youth leading some organizations, rather prominent organizations, towards divesting their money. We've seen a lot of action from there. What would you like to share with us? What do you think we should pay attention to from those movements? And I know with your work at Greenpeace, you've obviously also worked with a lot of youth.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I feel a great deal of humility in being invited to offer some thoughts, and clearly not only offering an outside perspective in geographical terms, but I'm perhaps closer to the average age of the presidents than to the youth leaders. However, having worked, as you say, with a number of movements, I'd like to offer that perspective, which is to say, looking at youth and youth leadership from a social movements point of view, we can see the impact in other parts of the world on the cultural narrative and shaping a different attitude or a different conversation around climate change that youth leaders have brought. We can see the access that youth movements have had both to corporate leadership and to government leadership, and the ability to really apply pressure around the big picture and the big story. And I think that comes from a lot of different places. On one level, the same inherent qualities that are also abundant in African youth, which is that passion, that sense of the future and the possible. And I think that's really important, the moral standing, the enfranchisement of being those who will be the leaders in the coming decades. But I think there's other pieces here as well that we could perhaps learn from and look to support in strengthening and empowering youth movements in Africa. And that's the principles around organizing apply. And I think looking for the connectivity between movement players and between youth activists so that they can have peer-to-peer support and solidarity, looking not just at the kind of institutional training and skills development that might come from some of the big structures, but also from philanthropy and civil society, and encouraging youth leaders and youth activists into other movements so that they can learn and strengthen their position. I think there's important principles around coming in behind youth when they get organized themselves to underpin the work they're doing, let them own and lead it, but ensuring that the skills development and the ability to really land some successes and some progress really build confidence over time. So I think looking at organizing principles, looking at taking momentum from the youth that get active and really making sure that it's supported and connected is a very powerful thing. And that can happen internationally, but crucially, I think we can learn a lot from looking at movements that have succeeded or had progress in other parts of the world. But truly, the real tactics, the real mobilizing forces and the real solutions will come from Africa and from the youth in African countries, very context specific, differently across the continent. And I think they very likely will develop solutions and tactics and impacts that will be useful for the rest of the world. So there's a real positive to looking at it in this way. So I think there's a real investment we can make as civil society and as philanthropy alongside governments and alongside more formal institutions to ensure that youth voice is heard. And that's the one thing I picked up from the other speakers so far, and where I'll finish, which is for motivation in a young person who has become active is dependent on feeling like they're making a difference and being heard, or finding a way or finding the right scale of arena to have an impact, which could be more local, could even be at a city level or a community level. To feel like a difference has been made is crucial in building that muscle and building that confidence to become an individual leader, but then collectively to become a movement of leaders.
Definitely. Build movements. Gugu, I know you've done a bit of work around leadership. Would you like to come in here? Anything you'd like to throw in?
Sorry, my internet sort of went. Can you please repeat that? I didn't get that, sorry.
Oh, I know you've done quite a bit of work around youth leadership and youth engagement on climate change. Is there anything you'd like to throw in here?
Oh, I think more than anything, the one thing that's sort of coming through now is the issue of engagement and the issue of stakeholder participation, right? And I think going forward, it is now time for both our leaders and policymakers in Africa, or even across the globe, to include youth and engage them at the community level, because that's where most action is needed, right? And I must give credit to some of the African governments that have been working to increase youth participation in, for example, international climate change meetings, but of course adopting a number of delegates to attend conferences such as the COP24, COP26. However, right now the problem is the issue of inclusion, making sure that more voices from marginalized backgrounds and most vulnerable groups, such as your younger women and women from the rural areas and youth from rural areas, are included in this policy making. So on that aspect, I just want to call on the inclusion part and making sure that these are intergenerational conversations that are being had at these tables, that this youth is being called on. But then of course, this also all feeds into the issue, as you're mentioning, of intersectionalism and making sure that we are advocating for climate policies that are inclusive, that are intersectional, and to make sure that we're also advocating for intersectional environmentalism, which sort of leads to, we can't speak about climate change adaptation and climate change activism without talking about climate justice. And this sort of leads to one of the panelists mentioning the issue of agriculture. So it's all in the inclusion and the participation of young people, making sure that these marginalized voices are included in this discussion and the decision-making processes.
Definitely engagement, not just tokenism, youth, actually getting youth to participate, not just youthful leaders. And no, haven't you seen that before? Where it's like, this is our panel, this is our youthful. But moving on, and I think moving from the conversation of government and taking back our power on what we can do. Many of Africa's brilliant minds are educated abroad, so in the US or in Europe and the like. And the problem here is that they often don't return home. They seek prosperity both professionally and financially abroad, in places where rankings from institutions such as WTO reflect that those places are easier to conduct businesses in, and it's easier to find financial investment there. How do we navigate that problem so that our brilliant African minds can come home and solve our problems? And so we're not importing ideas and we're not importing solutions, and we're building our own solutions that respect our cultures and thus can work, and maybe even exporting solutions to the rest of the world. Tumi, do you want to weigh in on this one? I know you're quite, do you want to weigh in on this one? I saw you're doing your master's at UCT currently.
Yeah. No, it's just been very interesting to hear because like I think I sit just slightly outside the activist movement within the panel, because we look at this from a capital perspective. I applaud and I'm always envious of like the kind of energy people put into their activism without understanding who funds it, and how these flows typically are negotiated, and what expectations are there for a return by those who obviously fund these structures and these things. So my entire outlook on the climate justice issue has always been follow the money, and how do we recalibrate what is the capital expectations around climate resilience and the resilience dividend. We've been working quite a lot on defining for ourselves what a resilience dividend should look like in an ESG perspective, so an environmental, social, and governance perspective within the private sector. So we know the taxpayer base that typically supports the activist movement from my parents' money, your parents' money, our taxes. But there's a pot of capital that exists outside the revenue base from tax that one can harness and activate through pension funds, through saving schemes, through through insurance policies, there's a whole variety of models that need recalibration and rethinking and reimagination, because the people that typically sit with the allocation decisions in those structures are also uneducated about the climate resilience issue. It's actually quite funny, because you just look at a different lens and you apply the same sort of schematics and the same issues. And my thesis for my master's is actually that. It's how do we redefine the risk and return profile of these assets that have an impact on the ground in the communities towards a more climate neutrality, or a reckoning with the environmental consciousness upon which businesses have to be built. So what does the risk and return profile look like? Are we deviating far from the mean? Are we coming back into it? So an analysis of about 20 years of data around that. And also, what is the return profile? And the returns aren't necessarily just locked into IRRs for pension funds, not just 25% return or multiples. There's other kinds of dividends that come through that haven't been captured quite well within the economic systems, that underpin these conversations. So a rethink and a reimagining, and being empowered, I think, to challenge the current status quo around who finances these things, what do they look like, and what do they expect from us? And if we feel empowered enough to say, okay, this lens it's paternalistic, and it's probably racist, and it's also it's got a westernized lens, of expectations that aren't necessarily matched to the things in the community on the ground. And we need to be building capacity and capitalizing that capacity to be able to sit in front of these powerful forces and say, we don't agree with you on what you expect from us. So I think that's where we come in very strongly as an organization like Ushiri, saying we're not our parents. We went to school, we traveled, we've seen the world post 26 years of apartheid or slavery or colonization or all of these things. And I think what we demand and expect is very different from how these guys were negotiating these positions in the past, because we understand that it's the flow of funds that ultimately will impact on whether these conversations are mute or they've got energy to sustain them.
Definitely. So we need to know our power, and when we get to the negotiating tables where we're talking funding, we need to get there with some big energy. So we know what we're talking about. And then definitely on closing the gap between the funding and the activists. That's what we have it for. I think we can now I don't know what's it called, sire you as our resident capitalist.
Sorry,
so the money is there. We need to know how to access it. Gugu, and then after Gugu, Akufuna, please come in.
Sorry for sort of cutting you there, but also I wanted us to speak more on the issue of us retaining young graduates in Africa, and the reason why we sort of can't do that, especially for those who've gone and studied abroad. Available data has sort of shown that youth unemployment and migration, not just an African problem, but also a global phenomena. And I think we as the young people, rather we as young Africans, need to think more about that. So one of the data points that I sort of found within the Afrobarometer is that a significant proportion, in fact, more than half of young adults who are between the ages of 18 and 25 who are highly educated, who are from the urban areas, are most likely to leave their countries, or rather most likely to leave their continent. And one of the reasons when Afrobarometer asked, 46 or rather 44% of them said that they'd leave Africa because they'd like to find work. 29% of them were to escape poverty or rather even economic hardships. So it's not a matter of why we are young people not coming back to sort of assist Africa when it comes to such challenges and such difficulties, but the issue of opportunity, the issue of economic hardships within Africa is what's sort of chasing away African youth. And I think that we can't speak about young people changing Africa without us speaking about the issue of migration and the reasons why, as to young people decide to flee or rather even leave their respective countries.
Very valid input on that, Google, that people are actually just trying to survive. Before people are even trying to prosper and live their luxurious lives, they're just trying to survive, which I think speaks back to what Dumi said, that there actually is money. What we need to now learn is, how does this money work? How do we use this money? How do we, instead of then migrating, instead of then saying, I'll go and escape this problem by moving to wherever we're going and leaving the money here, how do you then begin to tap into that money to create a livelihood? Akufuna.
Yeah, first of all, I'm so excited about this question and also the contribution from E2 and Google. Most importantly for me, I think there's nothing wrong with an African youth going abroad to study. But there's something wrong if I'm going to Europe or Western world to study, to find solutions for Africa. Africa needs to find its own solutions, and we have a lot of indigenous knowledge that is lying out there, not structured. We need to invest in the research to define the indigenous knowledge. We have the nature-based solutions and a lot of information that we can actually put together in a more structured way. But of course, there is need for money. And this comes to what we call political will. Where are African governments spending most of their monies? Where are they spending most of their monies? I'm just now looking for an opportunity for a scholarship to study masters, but I can't find it easily here in Africa. It's difficult. It's not easy to find a scholarship to study here in Africa. But if you go outside Africa, there's a lot of resources put in place to support young people to study, to do research, and so on and so forth. We need that in Africa as well, so that at least we can invest in African young people. That means our government should have the political will to put money on climate change related activities, research programs, and also scholarships, so that we can have people that actually travel from America, from USA, from England, from China, coming to Africa to learn from the African soil, to learn about the African indigenous knowledge, and also what we have in regards to nature-based solutions. So that way, I feel we can be able to turn around the situation where we have, young people migrating to other parts of the world and never coming back. We need them back, and we have to have something for them to do. We are young people, we are looking for opportunities every day, and of course, we are all aging at the same time. So I will not just sit idle and just wait and wait and wait. If there are no opportunities, I will go where there are opportunities. So it is upon us to demand for our governments to start investing in the relevant sectors, like the climate change sectors, that demand the involvement of young people. We need to educate our young people. We need to sponsor research and support research as much as possible, so that at least we can channel resources to what is right. If we all believe that climate change is a serious issue, it's an important issue and an important subject that has got greater impact on the development spaces of Africa, then let's demonstrate it on how we spend our monies. I cannot say today that transport is very important for me, but when I've got money, I buy beer to drink. I have to invest in finding resources to buy means of transporting myself from one place to another, if that is important for us. So if agriculture is important, if sustainable development is important, if young people are important, let's put money there and then see what we can get out of that. So that's what I want to also share in that space as well. It is very important, and we need to do something about
definitely. Thank you for highlighting on the importance of research, amplifying Gugu's message from earlier on the importance of research and funding research. If you're going to read on climate change in Africa, none of those names are African. So few of them are African, and those who do it sometimes are self-funded. There is so basically fund Africans, guys. Robin, I'm going to bring you in now. Earlier, Itu spoke, to me, if someone's going to listen to the audio of this, they'll be like, who's Itu, who's Itumeleng, who's Tumi? Earlier,
Itu is people from the northern part of like South Africa. Tumi is from the south, and Itumeleng is my mother when she's like really pissed off. So.
a man with many facets. So, Robin, earlier Dumi spoke about how the activism world and the funding that is funding their work and that they're trying to divest and so forth. They're so far away. You have worked in both at Greenpeace. You are now at UMI Fund. How do we bring those together?
I think it's about choosing the focus, the arena in which we want to achieve whatever those philanthropic or investment outcomes are intended to do. And one of the things that we haven't come to yet, but I think is perhaps looming over this conversation a little, is at what scale does the political or investment impact that we're looking for have to happen? A lot of the time the conversation is global, it's about the United Nations or international level diplomacy, or it's national. And a lot of those arenas are very divorced, very abstract, or they're very challenged by vested interests. A national government is often under a huge amount of multiple pressures, or is captured by corporate interests or historical geopolitical relationships. That's not to say that more local level government or more local level decision making isn't also full of challenges, but those arenas can actually present other opportunities for learning and also for proving models and impacts. And I think bringing together activism and bringing together social goods, so not just financial returns, but actually some of those dividends that we've been hearing about already, is possible at that level and can start to show the sorts of solutions that are generated from within Africa or from within African countries or within communities within African countries, so that they can be held up, can be learned from, and can be replicated. So I think for me, the place where investment comes together with activism and where learning and leadership comes together with political impact is in finding the scale that works. And maybe that's a city municipality where a combination of youth activism, recognizing the informal sector and waste pickers, and looking for maker spaces, as we heard about in the video, creates a solution for local waste that is making the community more resilient. Perhaps it's generating compost for urban farming and generating livelihoods for waste pickers or for families, while delivering an urban service for the city that is cheaper and more effective than buying in some kind of corporate waste management company from abroad. So it's those kinds of examples, and they'll be across all sectors, whether it's energy, whether it's waste management, whether it's food, and they will be locally relevant. They'll be coming from the people who are living on those particular front lines for the impacts, but also who potentially are delivering the solution and reaping the benefits. And so for me, that's the number one thing I would bring, or as an outsider offering that perspective, is to look to draw the arena and the boundaries around the question at the scale where the impact can be very immediate and very relevant. And in particular, thinking about youth, where new leaders emerging in their activism and in their strength can touch success, can feel like they've had an impact, and can do that in combination with communities and with decision makers on the ground. And then I think once that becomes strong, you're building from the roots up. It's the grassroots kind of movement building I referred to before that can be expanded, connected, expanded, connected, and then suddenly you are national, or you are Pan-African, or you are having a collective African voice in the international forums that really speaks from grounded and really deeply rooted strength, and isn't being sort of brought in as a token, or isn't forcing its way in just at peak moments when the world is thinking about the UN conference, and not in between those times when actually a lot of the real work is happening. So that's my 2 cents or 2 pence or 2 small units of currency for you on that topic.
Well, if you were here, it would be your 2 tebe of insight. Definitely locally relevant. And once again, I think this is something that we touched on, building strong foundations so that when we take off, we're taking off from strong foundations. My next question, which we've already gone into quite a bit, is what tangible improvements in livelihood, to see tangible improvements in the livelihoods of all Africans, there needs to be finance to support these projects, and what actions we believe must be taken. I believe for the most part, we've touched on this quite a bit. Nazreen, you hadn't touched on it yet. Would you like to weigh in? If anyone else would like to add, you can put your hand up. Nazreen? Okay. We seem to have lost Nazreen there. Okay, anyone else like to weigh in here before we move on?
It's just a very short point for me, Pat. I think one thing that we need to sort of stress on the issue of climate finance, and I think maybe, I don't know if it clicks within our governments, but also the fact that majority of them have signed the Paris Agreement. And I think the success of it is largely dependent on climate finance, right? However, we as young people, even us as climate change advocates or even climate change activists, need to advocate for financing, which is one, as part of some of the panelists have mentioned, accessible to not just to the elite, but also to the most vulnerable countries and minority groups, which of course include young people, especially young people that have projects that address respective climate change effects and climate change projects within their respective countries, because even if we do offer this climate change finance, it can't be a copy and paste. What works in Botswana will not necessarily work in South Africa, right? Botswana has a very different and a different climate change problems that they're dealing with. What South Africa is the issues of drought, whereas in South Africa we have largely flooding, right? So even with that finance, we need to make sure that it speaks specifically to the problems that each country, African country, face, so that even though it's accessible, but also it must be able to aid whatever each country is sort of facing.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Sorry,
Sorry, please go ahead.
Sorry, like, no, I was just gonna say that, like, there's a lot of because the continent has transitioned so much over the last 100 years. You have to apply a historical context to any sort of transition that happens, and there's a peer learning exercise across all fronts. South Africa is like, we are like the worst because we were dogmatized by not only colonization and apartheid, but also, you know, an extraction of value so immense. When apartheid ended, like the country's revenue base was always kind of like from its natural resources, and you think about Norway, you know, as a very good example of how you do it right. It's your gas, it supports the citizens, and the country becomes prosperous from its own natural resources. Whereas within an African and a South African context, those natural resources are funding lifestyles in the UK and the US and all over the world, and not necessarily to bolster a revenue base for our own development, you know. So I bring this forth as just one way in which we have to think about what is capital before you even think about how to disperse it. I think there's a very interesting you know, conversation I always have with people around. Do you know what is your money? You know, and what sits behind the restrictions for deploying it. So, you know, you deposit your salary into a bank, and the moment it hits the bank's bank account, they have a responsibility to Basel III and all of these other statutory requirements as to how they need to disperse your money, you know. And a very similar model for how, if you pay insurance to Old Mutual or Sanlam or any of these big insurance companies, they also have these statutory regulations around what they need to do with your money. And I think if we combined that kind of insider knowledge around what is the money that's available out there and why it flows in a certain way into certain projects, and what we need to be strategic about as climate activists around accessing it to the T according to like those specific requirements, we would go a long way in being able to unlock some of these very complicated conversations around giving proper energy and impetus and motivation to some of the projects that like everybody else is putting out there. Because there is currently a massive divide between activism, entrepreneurship, and, you know, political will and capital. And I think we can advocate for, that's why I love these sort of forums. It's that like we can say we exist, you know, we're not in the shadows, we're not behind the big banks. We've taken ourselves out of those scary buildings, and now we're out there in front of you guys saying we are here to help bring some of that intelligence into the ground so that we can all kind of create solutions or co-create solutions for the betterment of our communities and the environment out there.
So we should know our money and take it a step further by knowing what money is available to us. When you speak of South Africa having used their resources, I think Botswana, we are always celebrated for the way that we used our resources. In terms of diamonds, I mean, guys, if you want to know about an African success story-ish, I mean, right now, critical but stable, but sometimes it be that way. Look up how Botswana used their diamonds. And then Google, back to the point that you were saying on how funding is structured. That is one of my frustrations within activism and the funding of the structuring of funding that is almost only available to the elite, to people in offices, and activists and grassroots people who are doing the work on the ground are getting none of it. You'll get a fund that will say, here is $20,000 for strictly administrative fees. You can't pay salaries, you can't pay allowances, you can't do this, but you should pull off this amazing project that will obviously, I mean, if you look at it, it'll be so amazing, but how is that person going to get to work if they're not getting an allowance? Where are they going to wake up from to come and execute this project? How are they going to get there in terms of transport? Where are they getting the energy to be able to do that work? So those are some of the nuances within the funding of activism that drive me a little bit crazy. To those joining us online, please note this session is being run as part of the Scaling Up and Empowering Movements for Climate Change Advocacy project, which draws stakeholders together for co-learning about how to influence policy and promote climate advocacy. As such, emergent discussions will help inform the principles needed for enabling conditions for revitalizing civic and social participation. So to revitalize your civic and social participation, you can be part of the conversation by submitting your questions. We'll look at them just now at the end of our conversation, and I will pose them to our panel. So please join us in this very interesting conversation. I'm really enjoying this conversation. And then now back to our question. How can local governments play a part in strengthening the voices of marginalized communities? Gugu, you've been touching on this quite a bit. So marginalized communities, we're looking at indigenous people, to some degree, women and young people, in shaping local climate action. How do we bring them on board? Because a lot of marginalized communities are already doing work that's not by choice, but they need to survive the effects of climate change. How do local governments bring them on? Gugu, let me see, is Nesreen in? Okay, Nesreen isn't in, but Gugu, please.
She's here, but I'm guessing it's probably internet connection issues. I think, Patu, more than anything, it all goes to our initial discussion in terms of the inclusion. I think Africa struggles a lot with having solutions that are meant for African problems. Africa is always even African leaders, African governments, even us as young people, we have the tendency of taking Western models and Western solutions and try implement it within African context, of which that doesn't work, right? And I think now's the time for us to start crafting solutions and start crafting answers that are a country-specific one when it comes to Africa, but also one that are region-specific. So in as much as governments are still trying to use information or even solutions that are created in the West, they should also have room for us to be able to curate ones that work for us in our respective countries. And I think now that we've seen it now playing out within COVID-19, during this COVID-19 pandemic, is that actually even though it is a health-related pandemic, but also one single it is also another single manifestation of the ecological emergency. As a direct result of our mismanagement and even exploitation of the natural world, right? But what COVID-19 right now is sort of shown us or even taught us is that it also underscore a fundamental concept about climate justice, or even about justice in itself, that frontline communities have sort of known and felt for far too long. The communities that are impacted the most in Africa, not just in South Africa alone, by climate change and experiences largely the climate effects, are the ones that are mostly not even contributing to the greenhouse gases, right? So now the opportunity now stands with also African governments and us in terms of fixing this and making sure that we work on a basis where we have climate solutions that are intersectional. We make sure that we advocate for what we call intersectional environmentalism, right? Because that will integrate social justice. And if it integrates social justice, it means the ones that are the poorest are the ones that benefit more when it comes to providing solutions for climate adaptation and climate, well, pretty much surviving the effects of climate change. So the concept of intersectional environmentalism is the one that we should stress more, especially even for government, for example, as it advocates for both the protection of the people and the planet.
That is quite noteworthy, especially because the effects of climate change are gendered. They will affect the poorest, the worst. Nisreen, I'm so sorry for neglecting you in conversation. When I couldn't see your video, I thought you weren't here. Please weigh in.
I wasn't here, that's very true. I had connection issues. Yeah, I haven't following the last few minutes because of the connection, but I want to build on my colleague previous said. I want to highlight three main facts. Number one, when we talk about climate investment or climate friendly investment, we are not talking about climate finance. These are two different terms. For us, climate finance should only fall under the historical responsibility of the developed and big emitters country to the developing and least developed countries. When we talk about climate investment, which is the green jobs, is creating a general income and jobs for the new generation, which is actually green, which is actually more sustainable than we had before. Mixing these two things is a very dangerous, especially that we in Africa, we did not cause climate change, but yet we are the most impacted by climate change. And we should keep this also always in tracking in the very much beginning of our heads when we make any discussion or start any conversation with anyone. No more debt about climate change, no more loans. It's not an aid, it's not a humanity charity or something. It's our right as new generations that will suffer from climate change to have this climate finance from people who actually cause climate change. The second thing I want to highlight is the need for very much more strong African community. And when I say African community, I don't mean only the people, but I mean the general African community. The people who represent us, the people who do the work on the ground, the people who actually make the policies and laws and legislations inside of the countries. If we did not actually make it very clear that we are on one side, we are not actually fighting against each other, we are not enemies, we are in one side, and the only way to succeed our efforts is to work together and work collectively, we will not actually go anywhere. The third thing I need to actually highlight also, and this is one of our very much lessons that we learned in the very hard way, is the need for urban planning. Urban planning is a very important issue because nowadays people are moving not only from countries to countries or from continents to continents, but there are huge movement from the rural area to the urban cities. And that's because mainly the people in urban cities work in either agriculture or pastoralism, and these two things are very much vulnerable sectors to climate change. If we couldn't actually secure their jobs, their livelihood, they will move to urban cities, and urban cities is not going to feed us. Urban cities is not going to actually be able to handle this number of pressure of population, because every city have especially in Africa, very low infrastructure comparing to other countries and continents. So having more population makes it even more harder for the people working in the urban cities to control it and to control the distribution of the services. And all of this makes the climate crisis even harder and even more effective, and actually not effective, even more devastating than before. I will give you another example related to the floods that we had in Sudan here. So all of the areas near to the Nile was deeply affected by flooded actually by water, and we had to move people. They actually had to leave all of their clothes, their belongings, their furniture, and everything inside, and just run with their lives. And when we tried to actually give them a camp, so they were very sad. And then we discovered that there were actually either refugees from South Sudan or IDPs from another rural areas or conflict areas such as Darfur. So they were actually coming from a marginalized area, and they were marginalized community. And when they came here and the Nile flooded and the flood of the climate crisis happened, they were again marginalized and again undermined, and again they went back to camp, because we had camps to hold the people who actually lost their homes. So they were affected twice, and this what will happen in every week slice of the community. They will be affected by climate change twice. So they will leave their home, their land, their work, their agriculture, their cattle, and move to the urban areas. And when a climate crisis happens because of the lack of planning, because of the lack of infrastructure and so on, they will be again impacted by climate change. So I think we own them at least to spare this torture from them, and at least introduce them to a better world, and also do a better planning to our urban cities.
Definitely. It's quite sad the number of times that some people are being hit by climate change, and because of the situations that they're in, they're not necessarily able to not help themselves, so to speak. So yeah, what I really liked that you said was that climate finance, we need to be careful. It's not a donation, it's people paying a bill of something that they consumed. So I'm going to go on to our last question. So we have time for questions from people joining us online. And with the question, I wanted to close, well, my questioning will be closing on taking back our power and looking at what we can do and how we can drive action. And the question is, how can we actively bring this important urban community? Nisreen, you touched on urban and community. How can we bring the urban community together with local governments to achieve climate action at scale within city regions? We've seen brilliant We've seen brilliant young Africans who are active within the climate change space, who are activists, who are working on different projects such as solar and the such, but they are always working outside of government structures, and they're always working out of such structures. What can they then do for us to come together and augment maybe some of the government's efforts? So everyone will have a chance at this one because it's my last question. Robin, we'll start with you. Actually, no. Let's start with Itu, and then we're going to go to Akufuna, and then Robin. I'm looking at you on my screen. Itu?
So I think the critical thing, sustainable goals, like I think it's number 17, partnerships. It's important that it be recognized and acknowledged that we are not solving any of these crises in isolation. So there needs to be a platform of conversations that happen to bring together knowledge bases, experiences, and collaborate towards empowering local governments as the custodian of like the people's trust at community level to do effectively what they need to do, you know. And when I say that, I just want to say, like, because if we don't recognize that what local governments typically are empowered to do through constitutions, there's a mandate that's actually quite closed around what it is that, like, they can do and cannot do. And for all of the other stuff, they need to be empowered by organizations and people and structures that kind of allow them to do what they need to do very well. And that platform conversation, you know, this kind of like discussion around the fire needs to be activated, funded, and also, you know, nurtured for growth and collaboration. And I think so. For me, it would be fascinating to see over the next 5 years what happens within the partnership structure. We need to be very smart around how we partner up with the relevant people within these different institutional frameworks that will ultimately empower local governments to do what they're mandated to do. So that would be my contribution, man.
SDG 17, partnerships. So can I just ask you to keep your answers a bit short, because we still have the questions to do, and Kate just gave me a heads up that we're running a little over time. Akufuna.
So simply, let's take the climate subject personal. If you're in government, it's not a government project, it's not a civil society project, it's not a private sector project, it is a personal issue. And if we take it as a personal issue, every individual, whether in government, civil society, private sector, wherever you are, entertainment industry, this will be an important issue that concerns our life. It's a matter of life and death. We don't do anything about climate change, we'll all be gone. And everything that we treasure in our environment, our nature, will all be gone. So this is a personal issue, and let's ensure that all of us have a role to play. Therefore, collaborate, work together, and find solutions, finance the solutions, and change our environment, and also build the resilience that we need to see in our communities. In a nutshell, that's what I can say.
Yep, it's a personal issue. So when people tell you to mind your business, part of your business is climate change. Robin?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo something that Umi said about partnerships. I think there's a huge win-win at the urban and city level between activists and movements looking for livelihoods and solutions for local problems and resilience, and city governments within their boundaries of their authority providing services and doing a good job of running the city. And I think there's the potential to create the political space and pressure to do a better job of making better choices from the activist side, but there's also the need for institutional listening and to make sure that voices and solutions are being harvested and brought from the communities and from the activists on the ground. And I think that diversity of viewpoints, it requires some trust and it requires a little bit of generosity, but the benefit is across the board and very, very powerful. So thank you for asking.
Okay. Thank you for that, Robin. Trust, generosity. Google?
I think the other panelists have sort of said everything. I don't want to be long also, but I want to stress the issue of research and the importance of bringing in research institutions that are able to track the progress, or rather even the work that's currently being done, so that we don't repeat work. And so that even though we are partnering, but also we must make sure that we bring on partners that are high level and are experts in their work. So this includes research institutions that are able to make sure that they fit in information into whatever the government is sort of trying to achieve in each country.
Definitely. Nesreen?
Yeah, well, I guess we are moving very good when it comes to our personal sensitization of the importance of the climate change issue. I think what we should move to is to build better and strong institutes than we have right now. Institutes where young people have a normal place, a normal seat at the table, and actually a normal table for their own. Strong institutes that are more inclusive and more inclusion for when it comes to different kind of people, different backgrounds, different interests. And also stronger when it comes to the ability to absorb different laws and plans and legislations and funds and everything. So yeah, my recommendation will be definitely building better and stronger institutes than we have right now.
Okay. building stronger institutions. So we've got 3 questions coming in. I'll only be only one person will get the chance to respond. We've got 6 minutes and 3 questions, so I'm going to give you 1 minute. Nazreen, actually, I'm going to start with you. A question coming in: a climate crisis calls for radical change. Do you think we can achieve this with current global finance models? How do we enable a global transformation of finance given the current locus of power in the global north?
Yeah, so my answer to the first question is definitely no. We can't do anything, not mentioning radical changes with the current model of finance. And also, yeah, so my point is how to reach it is by being stronger. When you are stronger, you can demand your rights by far better than when you are weaker, comparing to the other part and the other side. And how can we be stronger? By knowing better, demanding more, and also sticking together. My last comment on this will be that unfortunately until now we don't even have a definition for climate finance. Any country can do any activity and put the bill of the activity as a climate finance. So not having a definition for climate finance is still a huge problem in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nazreen. So radical change is definitely needed. Question coming in here, Robin, I think this one is directed at you. Donors seem to be redirecting funds for climate health. How can founders leverage the learning? How can founders leverage the learning emerging from COVID-19 crisis to inform enhanced climate resilience? So do you understand that question, or should I rephrase it?
I please rephrase it. I want to make sure I answer the question that you want to hear answered.
Okay. So how can we leverage lessons from COVID-19 crisis to inform enhanced climate resilience, considering that donors seem to be redirecting funds from climate, I guess, to health?
Yeah, that's much clearer. Thank you. I think one thing is to make sure we don't see the two things as independent. This is another example of the intersectionality. The health crisis is the climate crisis, is the equity crisis globally and at national levels as well. I think the second thing is one of the things that's been exposed is obviously the fault lines of injustice and inequality as a result of the pandemic. But the third thing I'll say is many of the more successful responses to the health crisis have been locally driven, have been, not in the expected parts of the globe, have not necessarily been the expected parts of national governments. And often it's the local provision that has been the most important, whether that's mutual aid groups and communities or whether it's local government. So taking those lessons means investing as funders in climate movements from the grassroots up, and it means investing in intersectional movements that are built on community knowledge and solidarity.
All right, thank you for that. The two are definitely not separate. I saw when it was starting, I think it was in East Africa, where there were also floods. So they were dealing with both flooding and COVID-19. And then another question that comes in here, I'm going to direct it at Gugu. Often youth movement building is perceived as hostile, emotional, or irrational. Do you have examples of how you have effectively facilitated intergenerational dialogue in a meaningful way? So over a token representation, I think the reason I'm calling you Gugu is because you've done quite some brilliant work around here. I was looking at some of the awards that you've been awarded.
I think in answering that question, I mean, there's no, especially in the context of Africa, that the youth in South Africa is not necessarily the youth in West Africa, right? So it is definitely going to be region specific. So there isn't a direct answer to it, but also I think it also still bottles down to the issue of inclusion, and it also fostering conversations that are intergenerational. Also depends, is also very community based, right? In some countries, or rather even some communities, it's very frowned upon for young people to lead sessions to even lead consultations because of the nature of the culture and the nature of how things are being done. So the problem of intergenerational conversationing, or rather even conversing in other countries, is still very new. So we need to sort of ease into it, and also be able to get government and leaders and traditional leaders especially to sort of advocate for it, because I know it works in some countries and in some communities, but it is not the same. It is not the same response to other countries. So we sort of need a buy-in from traditional leaders, because most communities and even most countries still sort of heavily rely on community leaders and traditional leaders, even outside of government structures. So we need a buy-in from them in order for us to be able to foster these conversations at various, at different country levels. But in South Africa, I think now more than anything, the South Africans are sort of more open to young people leading, and hence we're seeing a lot of youth movements being developed, and we're seeing a lot of community-based projects that are led by young people. Is that South Africa is enabling or open enough to allow such conversations.
Definitely, and South Africa has a brilliant record of youth leading historical movements. And then on the question of people being emotional, like Akufuna said, it's a personal problem. We are going to be emotional. With that, we come to the end of our conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much to our panelists for their insight. Gugu, Nasreen, Akufuna, Dumi, and Robin, thank you so much. Thank you, Ikli, for putting it together. And I will probably be speaking again with most of you again. Take care. And yeah, now over to Paul Curry with the overview.
Thanks, everybody. I feel a bit like a surprise guest coming in at this moment. I'll put up my LOCS banner. My name is Paul Curry. I'm the manager of the Urban Systems team at LOCS4Africa and a proud member of the Resilient 40. So wonderful to see everyone here. Just from a few of the aspects that I heard in this conversation, I have a few keywords that I'd like to reflect back to our speakers and attendees. And those are the future, solidarity, intergenerational engagement, everydayism, and local government mandate. And I think we opened this with a call from Pato about the future being about young people. And so too is climate mitigation about the future. We're dealing not with our present emissions, but the future aspirations of our growing middle class, of young people. And so how are we helping to reframe what those aspirations are? What are the practices that we're encouraging in the next generations? We've also seen a shift from ignoring the future or being paralyzed by some of the despair of the future and the uncertainty to a need now where we see people who are actually planning for a dystopia. So what is our role as youth to create new imaginaries and excite people about what's coming up? And I think those go hand in hand with some of the points later. For solidarity, a number of you have mentioned the need to support each other, to build partnerships. And often we feel we're preaching to the converted in our resonating chambers. But someone said, yes, it may sound like that, but sometimes you do need to hear the choir sing. So getting that feedback, supporting each other in their endeavors, learning from each other, a strong theme, research, African innovation and learning, investing in these together. We often separate ourselves as youth in panels such as this. Here we've got our youth resonating chamber. We need to get more youth into our other panels as well. What is our role in engaging intergenerational conversations? How are we engaging with our elders? And most importantly, instead of only critiquing past movements, how are we understanding them, celebrating those achievements and adding to them and driving that forward? The term everydayism is my framing that we can be activists in different ways. And Tumi has mentioned this with a pragmatic approach to look at reframing finance. So there can be activists in organizations, activists outside of organizations, pragmatic versus challenging, internal, external, the idea generators versus the actors. And finally, with everydayism, how are we practicing everyday actions which do not accept the status quo? You know, crossing boundaries, having conversations, not getting caught only in our own agendas. In reflecting on a local government mandate, I want to borrow from another R40 member, Nazreen Alamin, who says we need trust, leadership, and access to resources. I was really excited to hear about the finance questions in this dialogue. How are we driving resources to youth, to our cities? As Nazreen has mentioned, the urban is the locus of global change. And particularly in African cities, if we do not get this right now, we are locking ourselves in to globally unsustainable systems. We will not achieve Paris Agreement. We will not achieve the SDGs if we do not frame our cities' growth properly. So here, the role of intermediaries, NGOs, external and internal actors to convene local governments with community movements is really important. And I really like Robin's point about choosing the right scale. Are we working at community level, neighborhood level? How are we connecting that to our leaders? So I'd like to close just with an appreciation of UMI and our SEMCA project, which is going to be exploring a lot of the ideas shared here, and looking at this nexus of how movements and government can learn together. And a huge appreciation to our panelists here and to our glorious facilitator, Pato, always a pleasure. And I'd like to close our ceremony, close our session by inviting you to join us in the LOCS4Africa closing ceremony in 1 hour, which will reflect on, how many are we? 6 days, 8 days of excellent inputs